would be more wonderful than anything else that had come before. But that is a story for next time. Genesis 1 and 2. Very good. The moment had come. God had finished creating all the beautiful things we see today. He made the earth and gave it light. He made the stars and planets in space, all the plants on the earth, the birds for the sky, the fish and whales for the ocean, and the animals for the land. Everything was good, and everything was ready for God's finishing touch. He took his hands and began to dig into the dirt. With the great love and care of a master sculptor, he formed a man. Every detail, from each individual hair on his head down to each individual toe on his feet, was perfectly placed. The only thing missing was life. And so God breathed the power of his Spirit into the man, and suddenly his heart began to beat. His lungs filled with air, and he opened his eyes to see for the first time. Then God planted a beautiful garden in a place called Eden. It was full of every kind of amazing food to eat, and God brought the man, who was called Adam, there to take care of it, to take care of the animals, and to live in peace. In the middle of the garden, God showed the man two special trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, telling him he could eat from any tree he wanted except this second tree, because it would bring only sadness and death. Then, for the first time, God said something was not good. The man was alone. God brought every animal to him so he could give them names, but the man saw that none of them looked like him. Each animal had a partner with whom they could spend their time, but not him. However, God knew something the man did not. He had a wonderful gift in store. He caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, God took part of the man's side, closed it up with flesh, and out of it formed his incredible new partner, a woman. The next time the man opened his eyes, God presented the woman to him, and he was in awe. Finally, this was someone who was just like him. God was so pleased to give this man the incredible gift of woman. He blessed them both and told them to enjoy each other and to have a family. Both the man and the woman were without clothing, but they had no reason to feel ashamed. As the sun set on the 6th day, God looked at all he had made, and it wasn't just good. He said it was very good. On the 7th day, God did not do any work. He simply rested and took joy in all that he had made. He wanted the man, woman, and all their offspring to enjoy it too. So he blessed it as a holy day of rest. Through God's creation, we see his love and care. We see how he is faithful to fulfill our needs and loves to give his children good gifts, knowing what is for our best. We also see in the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that God loves us so much that he doesn't force us to love him back, but gives us the choice. And next time, we will see how the choices of man will shape the rest of history. Genesis 3. Falling away. With choice comes danger. Sometime during the creation of all things, God also made messengers called angels. One particular angel was named Lucifer. He was a cherubim and held one of the highest positions in heaven. However, when he looked to the throne of God, he did not worship. Instead, he became jealous of God's power. He wanted to be God. And so he chose to rebel against God with a large number of other angels. Yet, they were defeated and thrown from heaven, and Lucifer became known as Satan, the enemy of God. Satan decided that if he couldn't have God's throne, he would try to hurt him in another way. All it would take was a little temptation. He disguised himself as a serpent, slowly slithered his way to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and waited for the perfect moment. It wasn't long before Adam and his wife appeared, and the snake asked a seemingly innocent question. Did God really say that you can't eat from any tree in the garden? We can eat from any of the trees in the garden, replied the woman, just not this one here. God said we can't even touch it or we'll die. That's a lie, said the serpent. God doesn't want you to know what he knows. I know what he's hiding from you. The woman and her husband looked at each other. God is hiding something from us? She asked. What is it? He knows that when you eat this fruit, said the serpent, you will know truth. You will know what is good and what is evil. And they leaned in closer, listening as the serpent looked around, his voice lowering to a whisper. You will be just like him. Desire grew in their hearts. The fruit did look delicious. Their eyes widened and their mouths began to water. God is so wise, the woman thought, as her hand slowly reached toward the fruit. Why wouldn't he want that for us too? What could be so wrong about knowing what God knows? Adam watched as she plucked it from the tree, brought it to her lips, smelled its sweet aroma, and took her first bite. Seeing that she had not died, she gave some to him, and he also ate, but did not die. The serpent watched with a knowing smile. As the couple swallowed the sweet fruit, a bitter feeling began to settle on them. They saw they had no clothes just as before, but now something was different. Something was very wrong. They felt guilt, shame, and a strong sense that they should cover themselves. They spotted a nearby fig tree, quickly took some of its leaves, and sewed together crude clothing. Just then, step, step, step. Adam and his wife looked at each other in fear. "God's coming," said the woman. "Run," whispered Adam urgently. And so they ran and hid in the trees of the garden. In the story of the fall, we see how Satan tries to make us question how good God is. He appeals to our pride and questions if we should really obey God. We see how sin can look so good at first, and yet it never lasts, and there are terrible consequences because of it. However, don't worry. We will see next time that even though bad things came because of Adam and his wife's sin, God was about to make an amazing promise. Genesis 3, 9 through 24. Consequence and Promise. God walked slowly and sadly to the middle of the garden. He knew everything that had happened, how Satan had tempted Adam and his wife, how they had doubted him, how they had eaten the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, sinned against him, and tried to hide themselves. He knew exactly where they were and called to them as a loving father does to his children. "Adam, where are you?" Adam replied from his hiding place, "I heard you walking in the garden, and I became afraid because I was not wearing clothes, so I hid." "Come out, Adam." "Who told you you had no clothes?" asked God. "Have you eaten from the tree?" "The woman you gave me, she gave me some of the fruit, and I ate," said Adam. God turned to the woman and asked, "What have you done?" "The serpent tricked me. He lied to me, and so I ate," she said with tears in her eyes. God looked to the serpent and said, "For what you have done, you are cursed. One day a child will be born, and even though you will hurt him, he will completely destroy you forever. Someday, he will make sure you never hurt my children again. Then God turned to Adam and his wife. He tenderly explained that life would now be very different for them. So much would now become difficult. They would have to work hard to have enough food. It would no longer be easy to have a family and to live in peace. And one day, they would die. God looked at his children and sighed, seeing how they had tried to cover themselves. It would not do. It was impossible for them to cover over their shame without him. So God made them clothing from animal skins. God covered their shame as only he could. Lastly, God told them they would have to leave the garden he had planted for them. You see, he could not bear the thought of them coming back to eat the fruit from the tree of life and live forever in pain, in sin, and apart from him. It wouldn't be life at all. Adam and his wife, whom he called Eve, walked silently with God to the edge of the garden. When they arrived, the Lord set a guard to make sure no one could find their way back to the tree of life. The paradise that God had given as a gift to them both was now lost. Life has been difficult for God's creation since that terrible day. We see the effects of sin everywhere. There is sickness, there is sadness, and there is death. Yet, don't be afraid. Remember God's promise to the serpent? One day, that child was born, and his name was Jesus. One day, he would give up his own life to cover over everyone's shame as only God could. One day, he will come again to rid the world of Satan and to make everything new. But that is a story for another time. Genesis chapters 6 through 10. Faith in the flood. Years later, there were many people on the earth, but they had turned away from the kindness and love of their Creator and toward every kind of evil. God saw all this sin and wickedness in his creation, how it filled him with great sadness, and knew it was time to begin again. However, not all was evil. In this same world there lived a man named Noah. Noah was a righteous man, faithful and true to God. And so, in his mercy, God chose to spare Noah and his family. One day, God spoke to Noah and instructed him to build an ark, an enormous boat, because he was about to send a flood to cover all the earth and wash away all the wickedness. Noah was told to take his family and some of every kind of animal that lived on the land into the ark to keep them safe. Even though it had never rained before, and even though it would be very difficult, Noah believed what God had told him, and he set to work, trusting that when God makes a promise, it will happen. The whole time the ark was being built, the wicked people of earth watched in wonder and disbelief. They mocked Noah, not understanding why he would build such a huge boat in the middle of dry ground. Noah tried to tell everyone to ask God for forgiveness. He tried to tell them that there was plenty of room on the ark. He tried to warn them to repent so they could escape the coming flood. But they loved their sin too much and would not listen. Finally, after much labor and dedication, the work was completed. Noah gathered all the animals on board, and then, sad that no others would join them, the faithful family entered the ark, and God closed the door. Suddenly, dark clouds gathered. Thunder roared all around. Lightning sizzled the sky, and it began to pour a violent rain. It was a storm like there had never been before and would never be again. Water even began to burst up from the ground, and for 40 days and 40 nights the rain fell, covering the earth in a flood higher than the highest mountain. Yet the ark floated safely on the rising waters, and inside, Noah, his family, and all the animals were safe. Months passed until the time was right, and God caused the floodwaters to go down. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Noah first sent out a raven that flew back and forth, but it couldn't find any dry ground. Then he sent out a dove, but it couldn't find a place to land either, so it came back to the ark. Would they ever be able to step outside again? 7 days later, Noah sent out the dove again, but this time it returned with a branch from an olive tree in its beak. When he sent it out again another 7 days later, it did not come back at all, and God told Noah it was safe to leave the ark. The earth was fresh and new, and Noah's heart was filled with such gratitude that he immediately worshipped the Lord. God blessed Noah and his family, promised he would never flood the whole earth again, and placed a rainbow in the clouds as a sign of this promise. As Noah and his family had children, and more people filled the earth again, they fell back into sin. The world today is much like it was before the flood. On the other hand, God is still faithful, still true to his promises, and still filled with mercy to save those who put their trust in him. However, it is not an ark God gives us to rescue now, but his own Son, Jesus Christ. Even when it seems too hard, even when it doesn't make sense, God asks us to put our faith in Him like Noah did, so we too can be saved. He can make us new again. Genesis chapter 11. The Tower of Babel. After the great flood, God gave Noah and his family a command. He told them to be fruitful, multiply, and spread over the whole earth. But as the years passed, Noah's descendants decided they did not want to obey his command. Instead, they wanted to stay together. They wanted to become famous. As they moved east, they found a large plain in the land of Shinar and decided to build a vast city with a huge tower that would reach into the sky so all the people of the world could gather and live in one place. They baked strong bricks and, using sticky bitumen for mortar, began to build the city and the tower. They worked quickly and very well together. Everything was going smoothly because at that time everyone spoke the same language, so no one became confused. As the tower grew and grew, so too did their pride. They felt unstoppable. They were defying God, and there was nothing He could do to stop them. Or was there? God saw the people building the city and decided to take a closer look. He was saddened by how much pride they were showing. He knew that if they continued to build their tower, they would think themselves so powerful that they would also begin to think they had no need for God, and that anything they put their minds to was possible. However, God knew that a life without Him would be a life of suffering. It wouldn't be a life at all. He knew that only great evil would come from their success. And so, because He loved the people so much, and because of His mercy and kindness, God decided to put a stop to their plans by confusing their language. Suddenly, they went to work on the tower, but couldn't understand what anyone else was saying. The work no longer went smoothly. In fact, it no longer went on at all. Everything was so chaotic that the people were too frustrated to continue building and abandoned the city and the tower that eventually became known as Babel. God then made sure the people scattered over the face of the earth, and so His command was fulfilled. In the Tower of Babel, we learn that obedience to God brings blessing, but disobedience brings only confusion. Pride keeps us from seeing our need for God. However, He loves us so much that He will remind us of just how much we can't live without Him. Job, chapters 1 and 2. Job's suffering. Sometime after the Tower of Babel, there lived a man named Job in the land of Uz. He was a good and righteous man who loved God and obeyed him, and he was extremely blessed. He was the wealthiest and most known man in the East, having 10 children, about whom he was always concerned and showed incredible love. Thousands of sheep and camels, hundreds of oxen and donkeys, and many servants. One day, as God was sitting on his throne in heaven, Satan came and presented himself before him. God asked him, "From where did you come?" "I have been all over the earth," replied Satan. "Have you seen my servant Job?" asked God. "He is a good and righteous man who loves and obeys my word." Satan became angry. "He only obeys you because you have blessed him so much. If I could take away his protection, his money, and all that he has, we would surely see how righteous he is." And then God said something that is hard to understand. "We will see," he said. "You may take all that he has, only do not harm his body." Satan left God's presence and set to work. One day Job was outside of his home when he saw a messenger running to him. "What is wrong?" Job said. Breathless, the messenger replied, "Your oxen and donkeys were out in the fields, but Sabian raiders came. They killed all of the servants and took all of the animals. I am the only one left." Before he had finished speaking, another messenger came running to Job with panic in his voice. "Job, the sheep were out in the fields with the shepherds, but lightning came down from the sky and all of them were destroyed. I only just escaped." While he was still delivering his message, another messenger came and said with tears in his eyes, "My lord, the Chaldeans came and attacked us. They took all your camels and every servant is gone. I was the only one who escaped." As this servant was speaking, Job looked past him and saw yet another servant staggering toward him. "What is it?" Job shouted, hardly believing what he was hearing. "Job," he stammered, "your children." Job's heart sank. What happened? They were all eating together. A huge gust of wind came from the wilderness. The house, it fell. They're all gone. Job, crying out in anguish, immediately tore his robes, shaved his head, and fell to the ground. Yet, instead of cursing God, he began to worship him, saying, "I came into the world with nothing, and that is how I will leave. God, you have given and you have taken away, but I will still bless your name." A short time later, Satan once again came before the throne of God, who said, "From where did you come, Satan?" "I have been all over the earth," he replied. "Have you seen my servant Job?" asked God. "He is a good and righteous man who loves and obeys my word, even though he has lost everything." Angry that his first scheme did not go according to plan, Satan blurted out, "That's because you wouldn't let me touch his body. Let me make him sick, then he won't be so righteous." Once again, God said, "You may do as you wish, but you must not kill him." Satan left God's presence and immediately struck Job with sores from the top of his head to the bottoms of his feet. Job was in miserable sorrow, but even when he was encouraged by his own wife to curse God so he could die, he refused. As Job sat alone, 3 of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, arrived. When they saw him, they all wept, tore their clothes, and simply sat with him in silence for 7 days and nights. In Job's story, we see a man who goes through immeasurable suffering, and it is hard to explain why God would allow Satan to take all that he had from this man. However, Job's reaction should be an encouragement to us all that even in times of hardship, we can still be faithful to our God because, as the rest of this story will show, he always will remain faithful to us. Job chapters 3 through 42, the wisdom of man and the wisdom of God. The 3 friends sat in silence alongside miserable Job. Suddenly, Job could no longer contain himself. He cried out in a loud voice, wishing he had never been born. He simply could not understand why so much tragedy had happened to him. Then, the friends that had wept with him in silence decided they'd had enough. Over the course of the day, they went back and forth with Job. Eliphaz told him that he must have sinned, and therefore God was right to punish him. Bildad suggested the reason for God's punishment was that his children must have sinned. Zophar told Job that God was going easy on him and should be punishing him more for his sin. The whole time, Job rightly insisted he had done nothing wrong and didn't deserve what happened to him. He wished there was some way he could speak to God and plead his innocence. Yet, through all the accusations from his friends, all the times they called him wicked, Job still proclaimed that God was his hope in suffering. At long last, Job became tired of defending himself and told his friends he would speak no more. Upon hearing this, a younger man named Elihu, who had been sitting and listening just outside the group, spoke up and rebuked Job's friends for accusing him. He spoke many words about God's greatness and his justice. However, he also rebuked Job for saying he was innocent. As Elihu was speaking, the sky began to darken and the wind began to blow. A huge storm broke out. Lightning pierced the sky, and thunder made the ground shake beneath their feet. Suddenly, God spoke directly to Job from out of the storm and began to question him. "Where were you, Job, when I made the universe? Where were you when I created the earth, the sky, and the sea? Did you command the stars and planets, and do you know them all by name? Do you control when it rains or snows? Are you in charge of the lightning and thunder? Can you count every animal? Do you know all their ways and provide each one with food?" Job could barely stand. He knew the answer to all of these questions. He told God, "I was wrong to question you. I will say no more." However, God was not finished, and he began to question Job again. "Job, will you condemn me? Do you understand all of my ways? Did you create the mighty behemoth, the huge dinosaur with its powerful tail and legs? Can you go into the sea and tame the massive Leviathan with its armored back and breath of fire?" Job stood amazed and humbled at what God had spoken. How could he have any response? "I am sorry for questioning you. I did not understand. Please forgive me," cried Job. And true to who he is, God did forgive Job. Yet God was very angry with Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar for how they had treated Job and told Job lies about God. He told them to offer sacrifices and to have Job pray for them. And, in spite of how they treated him, Job did pray for his friends, and God accepted his prayer, forgiving them. Afterwards, God blessed Job for the remainder of his life. He gave him twice the amount of sheep, camels, oxen, and donkeys as he had before. He even had 10 more children and lived another 140 years, seeing children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Though his heart would always ache for the family and friends he had lost, Job was ever thankful for the blessings God had given and taken away. Of course, nothing can replace what we have lost in hard times. We still, like Job, may carry the deep scars of our suffering. However, his story does show us that faithfulness and obedience brings blessing. It shows us how to be a good friend to those who are in sorrow, and it especially shows us that God never leaves us. Though we may never understand why God allows what he does, we must trust that the one who made all things and knows all things holds us in his hands, loves us more than we can imagine, and is with us through it all. Genesis chapters 12 through 13 and chapter 15. The Call of Abram. Around the time of Job, in the land of Haran, there lived a man named Abram. He was married to a woman named Sarai, who was unable to have children. One day, God spoke to Abram and told him to take all he had and go to a land he would show him. Then God made Abram a special promise. I will make you into a great nation, and you will have a blessed family. I will bless everyone who blesses you, but if anyone dishonors you, they will be dishonored. All the earth will be blessed through you. Abram didn't doubt. He didn't hesitate. He immediately obeyed, gathered his family, and followed God until he came to a place called Canaan. As he looked out upon the land, God spoke again and promised that he would give the land to Abram's children. God would continue to prove himself faithful to Abram for many years, bringing him through times of famine, protection from other nations, and blessing him with great amounts of livestock, silver, and gold. And yet, there was one way in which Abram and Sarai had not experienced blessing, which broke their hearts. They still had no children. That is why, when God came to Abram in a vision one night, saying he would be greatly blessed, Abram said to God, Lord, you have given me so much, but I have no children. How can I become a great nation? Then God told Abram to look up into the beautiful night sky. It was clear, cloudless, and filled with all the stars God had made. Do you see all the stars, Abram? God asked. Of course he could. Abram had often looked at them and marveled. But why would God ask him this? Count them if you can, said God. Abram knew it wasn't possible. There were far too many. He wouldn't even know where to begin. As he was still staring up into the sky, God told him one of the most wonderful things Abram had ever heard. You will have as many offspring as there are stars in the sky. Abram's mouth dropped open and tears welled up in his eyes. These weren't tears of sadness or doubt, though. They were tears of faith. He knew God was telling him the truth. God had promised him a home and an enormous family, and he believed with all his heart that God would fulfill this promise. It was all so wonderfully overwhelming. In his relationship with Abram, we see that God sometimes calls his children to go to unfamiliar places and to trust him with things that seem impossible. Our responsibility is to respond as Abram did, with total faith that what God calls us to do, he will equip us for, and what God promises, he will fulfill. Genesis chapter 16. The God who sees. Time passed, and still Abram and Sarai were unable to have a child. As they were both over 80 years old, it seemed like it may never happen. Unfortunately, this caused Sarai to become impatient. She went to Abram and suggested that he marry her servant girl Hagar, so she might have a child through her. As this was what many people who couldn't have children in Abram's day did, he thought it was a good idea. Maybe this was what God meant by his promise. Shortly after their marriage, Hagar did become pregnant. However, she became proud and began to mistreat her mistress because she could have children and Sarai could not. This caused Sarai to become very angry. She again went to Abram to complain about how Hagar was treating her. Abram did not want his wife to be upset, so he told Sarai that Hagar was her servant, and she could treat her however she wished. From that moment on, Sarai chose to be incredibly harsh with Hagar, to the point that the servant girl became afraid and ran away into the wilderness. On she walked under the hot, burning sun until she finally came to a cool spring of water on the way to a place called Shur. She sat down near the water, and as she was taking a drink, she heard footsteps approaching. Fearing it was either Abram or Sarai, she quickly turned to look. However, it was someone else, a stranger. "Hagar," he said, "I am the angel of the Lord." It was God. And much like he knowingly asked Adam and Eve where they were hiding, he asked Hagar, "Where are you coming from? And where are you going?" Hagar responded, "I am running away from my mistress Sarai." God looked at her and told her to go back to Sarai and to submit to her. He also made her a promise. Her offspring were to become a great nation whose number could not be counted. She was going to have a son whom she was to name Ishmael. However, though he would become a great nation, he would also constantly be against those around him, and they would be against him. Hagar listened to the angel of the Lord, and from that day on, she would call him El Roi, because she had witnessed the God who saw her and looked after her. Afterwards, Hagar walked back to Abram's camp, submitted to Sarai, and bore Abram a son when he was 86 years old. In the story of Hagar, we learn that we serve a God who sees and cares for each and every person, regardless of who they are. We see the trouble that comes when people become impatient for the promises of God to be fulfilled. God's timing is not our own, and we need to trust that God will do what He says, no matter how long it takes. And next time, we will see that waiting on the Lord brings immeasurable blessing. Genesis chapters 17 through 18. Son of Laughter. Years passed, and Abram was now 99 years old, and Sarai was 90, both far too old to have any children of their own. Ishmael had grown to be a young boy, and it looked like God's promise would have to be fulfilled through him. However, Abram's plans were not God's, and one day the Lord visited him to reveal that something unbelievable was about to happen. "Abram," said God, "as long as you obey me and draw close to me, I will make you into a great nation." Upon hearing this, Abram fell to the ground, bowing in worship. Yet God was not finished. He continued, "Your name is no longer going to be Abram. From now on, you will be called Abraham, and Sarai is to be called Sarah, because you will be the father and mother of many." God also reminded Abraham that the land of Canaan would belong to him and all those in his family who came after. And still, God was not finished. In fact, he was saving the best news for last. "You are going to have a son," God said, "but it will be through your wife, Sarah." In his shock, Abraham laughed. How could he and Sarah have a baby? They were both far too old. "But Lord," said Abraham, "what about Ishmael?" "He will surely become a great nation," God replied. "However, he is not the son I promised you. At this time next year, Sarah will give birth to a son, and you will name him Isaac. My covenant will be with him and his offspring for all eternity." With that, God left Abraham in stunned silence. How could such an incredible thing happen? Shortly after this, Abraham was sitting outside of his tent near some oak trees. Suddenly, he looked up and saw 3 men approaching, one of whom he recognized as God, and the other 2 were angels. He ran to meet them and bowed low, begging them to stay, have some food, and rest for a while. When they agreed, Abraham could hardly contain his excitement. He ran inside the tent and asked Sarah and a servant to prepare a feast of bread, meat, cheese, and milk. When everything was soon prepared, Abraham served his guests and stood nearby as they ate. While they were resting, the guests asked, "Where is Sarah?" Abraham answered that she was still inside the tent. Then God said, "Abraham, I will surely return to you this time next year, and when I do, you will have a son." Now Sarah had remained quietly listening to their conversation from inside the tent, but when she heard this, she could not help but laugh just as Abraham had. How could she, at 90 years old, have a son? How could Abraham, at 99 years old? However, God heard her laugh and asked Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too difficult for me? Is there anything that I cannot do? I promise you that this will happen." Sarah became afraid and tried to say she wasn't laughing, but God always knows the truth. In Abraham's story, there is a great deal of waiting. Yet, we see that God is faithful to his promises, never forgets them, and will encourage his people to keep trusting him along the way. It may take days, months, or even years to see God's promises fulfilled, but in the end, it will be worth the wait. We also see that it doesn't matter whether we think something is impossible for God. The one who made all things is also the one who can do all things. Genesis chapter 19. The Judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. When Abraham had first heard God's call to leave Haran and go to Canaan, he immediately obeyed, packed up his family, and left. One of those family members was his nephew named Lot. When they arrived in Canaan, they had so many animals that it became impossible for them to stay together. The grazing fields were simply too crowded. They agreed to separate, and Abraham gave Lot the first choice of where he wanted to settle. Lot looked at the land and saw that a place called the Jordan Valley was lush, green, and well watered. It would be the perfect place to move. The only problem was that this valley was also very close to the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. After Abraham had served God and the two angels their feast, he walked with them as they went on their way. Suddenly, God spoke. Many people have cried out to me against Sodom and Gomorrah, about their wickedness and their sin. I am going down to see these cities. Abraham, knowing that Lot was living near there and fearing that God was getting ready to destroy the cities in judgment, interceded on their behalf. Lord, what if there are 50 righteous people who live there? Will you destroy them with the wicked? God looked at Abraham and was proud of him for wanting to show mercy on behalf of the righteous. He replied, "If I find 50 righteous people there, I will not destroy it." "Forgive me for asking, Lord," said Abraham. "What if there are 45 righteous people there?" "I will not destroy it." Abraham asked again and again, lowering the number each time until finally God promised not to destroy the cities, even if he only found 10 righteous people living in them. Then God went on towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham went back home. That evening, the two angels came to Sodom and found Lot sitting at the gate, for he had moved to live inside of the city. He bowed before them and begged them to come and stay at his house. The angels agreed, but while they were in Lot's home, many of the city's men came and began to bang on the door. Lot went out to see what they wanted. In their wickedness, they demanded that Lot send out his visitors so they could harm them. Lot begged them not to, but they turned their anger against him. The angels struck all of the men with blindness and quickly brought Lot inside. "The people of the city will not turn from their sin, so God has sent us to destroy it," the angels said. "Quickly, gather your family together and escape." Lot tried to convince several of his family members to go, but they thought he was only joking and would not listen. Lot hesitated to leave, but the angels took him, his 2 daughters, and his wife by the hands and brought them outside of the city, telling them not to turn back, but to run. When they were a safe distance away, God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah with fire from heaven. Though they had escaped, Lot's wife turned around to look and began to run back, but was turned into a pillar of salt in all the destruction. In the sad story of Sodom and Gomorrah, we see the terrible result of a people that will not turn from their sin and how easily it can ensnare us. However, we also learn that God desires to be merciful and will not judge the righteous with the wicked. Finally, in Abraham's conversation with God on behalf of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, we see an example very much like that of Jesus, who stood between us with all our sin and God's judgment when he went to the cross. Abraham is a wonderful example of how we should pray for the salvation of others through God's amazing grace. Genesis chapter 21. Promises fulfilled. Shortly after God's visit by the oaks of Mamre, Sarah conceived, and when Abraham was 100 years old, she gave birth to a son, just as God had promised. They named him Isaac, and he indeed brought them so much joy and laughter. However, Sarah looked once more at Ishmael and Hagar and became angry. She went to Abraham and demanded that he send them both away so that Isaac would be their only child. Abraham was sorry to hear her say this and did not want to send them away because he loved them. Yet, God spoke to Abraham one day. Abraham, do not worry about Hagar and Ishmael. You may do as Sarah has asked, because I will take care of them. Isaac is the son I have promised, but because Ishmael is also your son, I will make him into a great nation. And so, sad but trusting in God, Abraham rose early in the morning and packed Hagar and Ishmael a sack of food and a skin full of water. He sent them on their way, and they traveled into the wilderness of a place called Beersheba. As they wandered in the hot sun, their food and water soon ran out, and they became exhausted. Hagar became fearful that Ishmael was going to die and placed him in the shade of a bush. It was all so overwhelming to her that she walked away and began to weep. However, Hagar was not alone. The God who sees knew exactly where she was. He heard Hagar's cries and spoke to her from heaven. Hagar, what is wrong? I have heard your cries. Lift up the boy, for you will both live, and he will become a great nation. Then God showed her a well of cool water. Quickly she ran to get Ishmael, picked him up, and gave him a drink. She filled up the empty skin with water, and with renewed strength and spirit, they continued their journey in the wilderness, confident that they were in God's careful hands. As Ishmael grew, God was with him wherever he went. He even lived in the wilderness and still became a great nation. God is faithful to his promises. He gave Isaac to Abraham and Sarah, even though they were too old to have children, even though it seemed impossible according to the world. He comforted Abraham when he was faced with losing Hagar and Ishmael, ensuring him that even if Abraham couldn't care for them, he could. He heard the cries of the two outcasts in the wilderness and provided for their needs. He fulfilled his promise to take care of them and make Ishmael into a great nation. In the same way, God is faithful to each and every one of his children. He makes a way when there seems to be no way. He cares, provides, and blesses those who are his. And next time, we will see God provide for Abraham in yet another situation that seemed impossible. Genesis chapter 22, One and Only Son. After some time, God came to Abraham. However, this time it was not with another promise, but a test. Abraham, God called. Here I am, replied Abraham. Take your one and only son Isaac, and go to the mountain I show you in the land of Moriah, God said. When you arrive, I want you to give Isaac to me as a burnt offering. Abraham could not understand what God was asking him to do. He had promised that through Isaac a great nation would be born, that he would have many descendants and a huge family. How could any of that happen if Isaac would no longer be alive? And yet, Abraham knew that God had proven himself faithful to his promises time and time again. He had watched over Abraham all his life, protected him through trouble and famine, had mercy on him when he made mistakes, and given him the son he promised. Abraham took a deep breath and simply trusted that the God who had the power to do all that was also powerful enough to raise Isaac from the dead. Early the next morning, Abraham got everything ready, woke Isaac and two of his servants, loaded his donkey, and they all began the 3-day journey to Moriah. When they arrived, Abraham saw the mountain and told the servants to remain with the donkey while he and Isaac went up to the mountain. Isaac carried the wood, while Abraham held the knife and torch in his hands. Isaac looked at his father and noticed something was missing. Father, we have everything we need, but where is the lamb for the offering? He said. Abraham took a deep breath. God will provide the lamb, my son. And so, the father and son walked up the mountain. When they arrived at the top, Abraham built the altar and laid the wood. He then turned to Isaac and gently began to tie his hands and feet. Though Isaac was much younger and stronger than Abraham, he did not struggle. He did not fight back. No. Isaac trusted his father, and he trusted God. Abraham laid his only son gently down on the altar. He reached for the knife and raised it high. But before he could bring it down and sacrifice Isaac, God called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" "Here I am," Abraham replied excitedly. "Do not harm the boy," God said. "Now I know that you trust me, because you would not even keep your only son from me." With tears in his eyes, Abraham heard something rustling in the bushes nearby. When he looked, he saw a ram caught in the thicket. Just as Abraham said, God had provided. He took it and gave it as a burnt offering instead of his son Isaac. "Abraham," God said, "because of your faith and because you were willing to give your only son, I will surely make you into a great nation. Your family will number as many as the stars in heaven and the sand on the seashore. Through them, every nation on earth will be blessed." Abraham and Isaac went down off the mountain and journeyed back home. In the story of Abraham and Isaac, we see an example of great faith in the face of great uncertainty. We also see a picture of a loving father willing to give up his only son as a sacrifice. It would not be the last time. Hundreds of years later, God himself would give his only son, Jesus, a descendant of Abraham, to be the sacrifice for the sins of the whole world. Like Isaac, Jesus would submit to his Father's will, fully trusting him. The promise that all the nations of the world would be blessed through Abraham would be fulfilled. It is not always clear why God asks what he does, but it is important to trust him completely with the outcome, because it will bring tremendous blessing. Genesis chapter 24. Isaac and Rebekah. After years of experiencing great joy in raising Isaac to be a faithful young man, Sarah died at 127 years old. One day, Abraham, who was also very old by now, called his most trusted servant into his tent. "Eliezer," Abraham began, "make me an oath and swear by the Lord that you will not allow Isaac to marry a Canaanite woman, but that you will go back to my old country and find a wife for him from among my own people." "Of course, my lord," replied Eliezer, "but what if the woman I find will not come with me? Shall I bring Isaac to her?" "No," said Abraham. "God has promised us this land. You must not take Isaac away from it. God will show you what to do, and if the woman will not come back with you, then you are free from your oath." Eliezer agreed and traveled with 10 camels and many gifts to Abraham's old country to a city called Nahor. He arrived in the evening and stopped by a well when he saw some women coming to get some water. He lifted his eyes and prayed that God would show him who he had chosen to be Isaac's wife through a simple test. If the woman he asked for a drink not only gave him one, but his camels as well, he would know God had chosen her. Sure enough, before he was finished praying, a beautiful woman named Rebecca came to the well. As soon as Eliezer asked her for a drink, she gave it to him. When he had finished his drink, she also offered to water his camels. Eliezer was so excited that he immediately gave her a golden ring and 2 golden bracelets. When he asked who she was, Rebecca revealed that she was from Abraham's very own people. Immediately, Eliezer worshipped God because he had answered every part of his prayer and led him every step of the way. Rebecca went home to tell her father all that had happened, and they invited Eliezer into their home to stay the night. However, Eliezer refused to eat or drink anything until he had told them about Isaac, his oath to Abraham to find a wife for his son, and how God had brought him to meet Rebekah. They agreed that God had worked in an amazing way. When they asked Rebekah if she was willing to go with Eliezer and marry Isaac, she said, "Yes, I will go." Eliezer gave Rebekah silver and gold jewelry as well as expensive clothing, and he gave her family many costly gifts as well. As she readied to mount one of the camels to leave, her family blessed her and said goodbye, feeling both sadness and great joy for her at their parting. Days later, in the evening, Isaac had gone out into a field to pray. When he looked into the distance, he saw a group of camels coming. At the same time, Rebekah looked toward him and asked Eliezer, "Who is that man walking in the field?" Eliezer told her, "That is Isaac." Upon hearing this, she covered her face with a veil and went to meet him with Eliezer, who told Isaac the incredible story of all that had happened. The two were married that very day and loved each other deeply. In this incredible story, we witness God working in every step of Eliezer's journey to find Rebekah. We also see a wonderful example of faith in Rebekah's willingness to follow God's clear calling to marry Isaac. In the same way, when God calls us, we are often faced with not knowing how everything will work out. And sometimes that can be frightening. However, God knows the beginning from the end, and like Rebekah, we need to trust Him enough to follow His lead. Genesis chapter 25. Twins. When Abraham was 175 years old, he passed away and was buried in a tomb by Isaac and Ishmael alongside his wife Sarah. God continued to bless Isaac and Rebekah, but after 20 years of marriage, they came upon a familiar problem. Rebekah could not have children. However, rather than take matters into his own hands as his father and mother had, Isaac did the one thing Abraham should have done. He prayed for his wife, and God was pleased to answer him. Rebekah conceived and was soon going to have a child. Yet, as the baby grew within her, something didn't feel right. It felt as if there was a war going on inside. Growing concerned, she went and asked God what was happening. His answer would be quite surprising. "Rebekah," God said, "there is not one child in your womb, but two. They will both become nations of people, but even though the one will be stronger than the other, the older child will serve the younger." True to his word, when Rebekah gave birth, she had twins. The first child, whom they named Esau, came out and was incredibly hairy. Then his brother was born, holding on to Esau's heel, so they named him Jacob. The two brothers could not have been more different as they grew. Esau loved to be outside and was a very skilled hunter. Jacob preferred to quietly stay inside the family's tents. The trouble was, instead of loving both sons equally, Isaac favored Esau and Rebekah favored Jacob. This was bound to lead to trouble between the brothers, and of course, it didn't take long. You see, as Esau was the oldest brother, he was set to receive the family birthright. This meant that when Isaac died, he would be given most of his father's riches and possessions. Not only that, but even more importantly, the promise that God had made to Abraham would have carried on through Esau. Jacob wanted what was due to Esau, and true to his name, was willing to cheat to get it. One day, Esau went out hunting in the fields. Jacob knew he would be gone a long time and would be very hungry when he came back. He also knew his brother was very impulsive. So he began to make a hearty, delicious lentil stew, and soon the trap was set. As Esau was walking back to the tents, the tempting aroma of food reached his nostrils. His mouth began to water, and his stomach began to grumble. He entered the tent and saw Jacob stirring a steaming pot of stew. "Brother," Esau said roughly, "give me some of that food. I'm exhausted." Jacob looked up at him. "You can have some food, but first, sell me your birthright." even though this would mean Esau would be giving up his inheritance, he responded, "I'm about to die, I'm so tired. What good is a birthright to me if I'm gone?" Jacob smiled. "So if that's a yes, swear to me that your birthright is mine." Esau nearly exploded. "Yes, I swear. Give me the food." Jacob gave his brother a big bowl of the stew along with some bread, and Esau ate it greedily. When he was finished, he got up and quickly left the tent, having considered the promise of God to be worth less than a bowl of stew. In the story of Isaac and Rebekah, we see the power of faithful prayer, and that God hears when his children cry out to him in faith. Yet, we also see the trouble that can arise when parents favor one child over another, and siblings who should love each other only look to gain advantage over the other. Finally, we learn that the future promises of God should not be so easily thrown away for what we can gain in this moment. Genesis chapter 27, the blessing. Years later, as Isaac grew old, his eyesight became so weak that he could no longer see. He grew concerned that he was going to die soon, so one day he called Esau into his tent. Isaac instructed him to go out into the field to hunt for his favorite food and prepare for him a delicious feast so that he could give his older son the special family blessing. Esau went out excitedly. He had given up his birthright to his brother Jacob, but there was no way he was going to give up his blessing as well. However, little did they know that Rebekah had been listening to their conversation, remembering what God had said about her older son serving her younger. Rebekah quickly decided she had to take action. She went immediately to Jacob and told him all that she had heard. Esau would be gone all day, so she instructed her younger son to bring her 2 young goats so that she could prepare Isaac his favorite meal, and Jacob could bring it to him and receive the family blessing instead of Esau. Jacob looked at his mother worried. However, he wasn't worried about how wrong it was to steal his brother's blessing. No, he was worried about being caught. Jacob said, "Mother, Esau is so hairy and I am not. What if Father feels me? He will know I'm not Esau, and then he'll curse me instead of bless me." Rebekah responded, "I have a plan, Jacob. Just do as I say, and if he curses you, let the curse fall on me instead." Therefore, Jacob went out and did exactly as his mother had said. She took great care to prepare a feast just the way Isaac loved. When it was almost ready, she went to where Esau kept his best clothes and dressed Jacob in them. Then she took the furry skins of the goats she had prepared and fastened them to Jacob's hands and the smooth part of his neck. Lastly, she gave Jacob the food with some bread and sent him in to his father. Jacob was nervous, but he tried his best to sound just like Esau. "Father?" "I am here," responded Isaac. "Who are you, my son?" Jacob took a deep breath and said, "I am Esau, your oldest son. I am back from hunting and prepared your food just the way you like it. Please sit up and eat so you may bless me." Isaac knew about Jacob stealing Esau's birthright and wanted to be sure he really was speaking to his oldest son. So he asked, "How did you find it so quickly, my son?" However, Jacob was ready for this question. "The Lord your God helped me, Father." Isaac still wasn't convinced. "Come here, my son. I want to feel you to be sure you really are Esau." Jacob nervously stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. Would his father find out? Isaac felt the hairy hands and said, "You sound like Jacob, but you feel like Esau. Is it really you?" Jacob quickly responded, "Yes, Father, it is." Isaac slowly began to eat the meal, all while looking suspiciously in the direction of Jacob. When he had finished, he called to his son, "Come near me, my son, and give your father a kiss before I bless you." Jacob slowly drew near and kissed his father on the head, and when Isaac smelled Esau's clothing, he was confident it was his older son before him. Isaac blessed him, asking that God would always provide for him, that peoples, nations, and even his own family would bow down to him, and that whoever would curse him, they would be cursed, and whoever blessed him, they would be blessed. With that, Jacob had yet again stolen from his brother. He hurried from the room, and no sooner had he gone out than Esau came in with a plate of delicious food. "Father," Esau bellowed, "Father, sit up and eat what I have hunted, so that you may bless me." Isaac was confused. "Who are you?" "Father," replied Esau, "it's me, your firstborn son." When Isaac heard these words, he could barely breathe. He began to shake, feeling sadness, anger, and fear all at once. Isaac asked, "Then who was the one who came in before you with delicious food? Who is the one whom I have already given my blessing?" Then Isaac realized what had happened. "Your brother Jacob. He tricked me. And now that I have blessed him, he will be blessed, and I have nothing to give you, Esau." Esau shook with rage, and hot tears streamed from his eyes. Jacob had not only stolen his birthright, but now he had stolen his blessing as well. Esau began to hate Jacob and muttered to himself, My father is about to die. When he does, I will make sure Jacob is next." However, a servant overheard him and told Rebekah. She became afraid for her son's life, and so instructed Jacob to pack his things and run away to stay with her brother Laban in her old homeland. She hoped that in time Esau's anger would cool and Jacob would be able to return. In the story of Jacob stealing Esau's blessing, we see examples of the trouble that can come when people take matters into their own hands instead of trusting God's plans and promises. Though Isaac may have known what God had told Rebekah, he tried to bless his older son because he favored him. As a result, Rebekah willingly deceived her husband and oldest son. Then Jacob willingly deceived his own father and brother. Sin leads only to heartache, struggle, and division. But obedience and faith in the promises of God, as we will see in future stories, leads to peace and blessing. Genesis chapter 28, the stairway in Bethel. Before Jacob left for Laban's home, Isaac called him into his tent. Nervously, Jacob entered, expecting the worst. However, Isaac chose not to mention his deception. "My son," began Isaac, "go to the house of Laban, your mother's brother, for you must not marry a woman from Canaan, but one of our own people." And then Isaac, fully knowing that it was Jacob standing before him, said, "May God Almighty bless you. May He give you success in all that you do. May He give you many children, and the same blessing He gave to your grandfather Abraham. May He bring you back to this land to possess it forever." Both father and son were moved to tears, and Isaac sent Jacob on his way. While traveling on the way to Haran, night fell, and Jacob became tired, so he made camp. He laid down and placed a smooth stone under his head so he could sleep, knowing that he needed rest for the long journey ahead. As he drifted off, thoughts of all that had happened with his family and of the uncertain future that lay before him raced through his mind. And yet, while he slept, he had a most incredible dream. In it, he looked and saw an enormous staircase that stretched for miles all the way from the ground where he lay to the heavens above. As he looked closer, he saw that multitudes of angels were walking up and down the stairs. As his eyes scaled the staircase, he noticed that God stood above it. Suddenly the Lord spoke with a very familiar promise. "Jacob, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham and of Isaac. The place where you sleep will be yours. You will have as many offspring as there is dust on the earth, and through you every nation will be blessed." Jacob looked on in wonder, yet God was not finished. "I am with you, and I will protect you no matter where you go. I promise, though you are leaving now, I will bring you back to this land, and I will never leave you." Jacob woke suddenly, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. He looked to the place where he had seen the staircase and said in fear, "God is surely here, and I didn't know. How awesome it is. It must be God's home." As he gazed out on the land, the sun was just barely breaking over the horizon. Jacob then took the stone that had been under his head and set it up as a pillar. He poured oil over the top of it and called the place Bethel, which means house of God. Then Jacob looked up into heaven and made a promise of his own. "God, if you will do as you said in my dream, if you will stay with me, protect me, and provide for me wherever I go so that I may one day come back to my father's house in peace, then you will be my God." Still amazed and shaken by his dream, Jacob rose up and continued his long journey to Haran. In Jacob's dream, we see just how powerful an encounter with the living God can be. We also see that even though Jacob did not worship him at first, God continued to be faithful to his promise to make Abraham a great nation, and chose to reveal himself in a way that would change the young man Jacob forever. He continues to do the same with each of his children today. Even though we may not always know it, see it, or believe it, God is always present for his children. We may not all have spectacular dreams like Jacob, but we can each know God through his word and the work he does in our lives. And if we look for him, he has promised we will find him. Genesis chapter 29. Deceiving the Deceiver. The morning after Jacob's encounter with God, he left Bethel to continue his journey and arrived at a well with a large, heavy stone covering it near the land of Haran. When some shepherds from the region came to water their flocks, he asked them from where they had come. When they said Haran, Jacob asked them if they knew Laban and if he was well. The shepherds answered, "Yes, we know him, and he is doing very well. And look, his daughter Rachel is coming with her sheep." Jacob looked, and as soon as he saw Rachel, he found her incredibly beautiful. He immediately ran to the well and rolled the stone off it all by himself and gave water to the sheep. Weeping with joy, he then embraced Rachel and told her that he was her kinsman. She ran to tell her father Laban, who then ran to embrace Jacob and bring him into his house. Jacob told Laban everything that had happened, and Laban was overjoyed to have him as a guest in his home. He stayed for a whole month in his uncle's house and enjoyed getting to know his family. Now Laban had 2 daughters, the younger, more beautiful Rachel, whom Jacob had already met at the well, and the older, Leah, who was more plain in appearance. At the end of the month, Laban came to Jacob and said, "You are family, but you have been serving in my house for nothing. Tell me, what would you like from me?" Right away, Jacob and Rachel's eyes met, and Jacob responded, "I will serve you 7 years if you allow Rachel and I to marry." Pleased that he would have Jacob serve him for so long, and seeing that they loved each other, Laban agreed. The next 7 years passed, but it only seemed to be a few days to Jacob, because he and Rachel loved each other so much. When he had completed his service, the wedding feast was prepared and lasted well into the night. When it became too dark to see anymore, Laban brought his daughter to Jacob, and they entered their home as husband and wife. However, the next morning, Jacob awoke to find that Laban hadn't given Rachel to him, but Leah. Jacob arose in shock and ran to Laban, saying, "Laban, what have you done? Why did you give me Leah as a wife? I served you for Rachel, but you switched them in the darkness. How could you deceive me?" Laban looked at Jacob and replied, "Jacob, my son, that is not how things work in this country. We never allow the younger to marry before the older. I'll tell you what I'll do. Spend the week with Leah, and at the end of it, you can also marry Rachel. In exchange, all you have to do is serve me another, say, 7 years." What could Jacob do? He loved Rachel and wanted her to be his wife, so he agreed and served Laban another 7 years. All the while, Jacob paid more attention to Rachel than he did Leah, showing her much more love and affection. Leah saw all of this, and her heart sank. In the story of Jacob, Laban, Leah, and Rachel, deception once again takes center stage. It continues to be a theme in Jacob's life and continues to bring division and heartache for everyone involved. Only this time, Jacob is the one being deceived, and notice he doesn't take kindly to it. Also see that even though it probably hurt Jacob when Isaac favored Esau over him, he continued to do the very same thing with Rachel and Leah. Just as it had between him and his brother Esau, Jacob's favoring of one daughter over another was bound to bring him trouble as well. And yet, God was still working even in this situation. We can see, and will continue to see in the future, Jacob being affected by the very sins with which he hurts others. God will often allow the sins in our lives to bring his children to a place of understanding and repentance. However, it remains to be seen if this will be the case with Jacob. Genesis chapters 29 through 30, A Growing Family. During the 7 additional years Jacob served Laban, God saw that he loved Rachel more than her sister Leah. Because the Lord cared deeply about Leah and saw how sad she was not to be loved, he gave her a wonderful honor and allowed her to have 4 children. Her firstborn son she named Reuben. Simeon was second, and was named so because Leah knew God had heard her sorrow. The next she named Levi, because she hoped that then Jacob would love her. The fourth was yet another boy, and Leah gave her praise to God by naming him Judah. Now, in what should have been a joyful time for the growing family, Rachel could not help but become envious of Leah. You see, all while Leah was having her 4 children, try though she might, Rachel was barren. With each baby born, her heart sank deeper and deeper, and she became more sad and angry. She pleaded with Jacob, but what could he do? He did not know why God had not given her a child. Well, Rachel was through waiting and decided to take matters into her own hands, making the same mistake Sarah had years before. So desperate was she to have a child that she gave her servant Bilhah to Jacob to be his 3rd wife. Sure enough, Bilhah was able to have 2 children named Dan and Naphtali. Yet, Rachel took no happiness from the boys, save that Leah could no longer say she was the only wife with children. Once Leah saw how Rachel acted, she became unsatisfied with her 4 children and decided to continue the competition. However, when she found she was unable to have more children, she gave Zilpah, her own servant girl, to Jacob to be his 4th wife. Zilpah then gave birth to 2 boys named Gad and Asher. Then Leah once again was able to conceive twice more and gave birth to 2 sons, Issachar and Zebulun, and a daughter named Dinah. Finally, Leah thought, after bearing her husband's 7 children, Jacob will love and honor me. It was at this time that God looked toward Rachel, the only one of Jacob's wives who had been unable to give him children, and showed her mercy. After all the years of heartache, fighting, and shame, he allowed Rachel to become pregnant and give birth to a son of her own. She named him Joseph, and though she was thrilled because she was blessed with everything she ever wanted, she also immediately asked that God would give her another. God would continue to bless Jacob beyond his 12 children. He made sure to protect him from more trickery by his uncle Laban, who had tried to cheat him out of increasing his flocks and herds. In all that he did, Jacob prospered. God provided for him in every way and gave him much success. In the story of Jacob's growing family, we learn that his favoritism brought harsh competition between Rachel and Leah that led to anger and jealousy in the sisters. We also learn the dangers of being unsatisfied with the blessings God has granted us. And yet, even though Jacob and his wives were all wrong in their attitudes and reactions toward each other, God still worked for Jacob's good and blessed him because of the promise he had made to Abraham years before. It would have been so much easier if they had simply trusted God's plan. But it is also important to remember that He is still able to work in spite of the flaws His children may have, in order to accomplish His good and perfect will. Genesis chapters 31 through 32. Israel. In time, Jacob found that because God had blessed him so much, Laban no longer treated him kindly. That is when the Lord came to Jacob and told him, "Jacob, the time has come for you to return home. But do not fear, for I will be with you." And so, Jacob told Leah and Rachel what God had said to him, and how their father no longer treated him well. They agreed that Jacob should obey the Lord's command, and that the time had come for them to leave. Therefore, while Laban was away from home, Jacob gathered his whole family, all his possessions, and fled back toward Canaan. When Laban heard that they had left in secret, he pursued and caught up with them so that he might take everything back. However, God was with Jacob and protected him by warning Laban not to do them any harm. When they finally parted, Laban ended up blessing his daughters and grandchildren. Sometime later, as the family approached Canaan, Jacob sent messengers ahead of them to find Esau and let him know he was returning. When the messengers returned, they looked panicked. "Jacob," they said, "Esau is coming to meet you and is bringing 400 men with him." Jacob was terrified. Years before, his brother had promised to kill him for stealing his birthright and blessing, and now it seemed like he was going to make good on his promise. Immediately, Jacob divided his camp into two, so that if Esau came and attacked one camp, the other could survive and escape. He then fell to his knees in distress and cried out to the Lord. "God of Abraham and Isaac," he began, "you told me to return to my home. You promised you would do good to me. I know I am not worthy of how faithful and loving you have been in all the time I was away. You have blessed me so much. I left Canaan with nothing, and now you have given me a family. I am so afraid now. Please have mercy on us. Save us from Esau. Keep the promises you have made." That night, Jacob instructed his servants to take gifts of animals and go out in groups in the direction from which Esau would come. He hoped that by giving him all these gifts, Esau would forgive him. In addition to sending out the servants and gifts, he sent his family away too, to separate them from himself for their protection. Jacob then sat alone in the night, thinking about all the moments that had led to this, his stealing from and deception of Esau and his father Isaac. God had been faithful to him. He knew that. Yet every time he thought of his brother's last words about him, every time he thought about the 400 men bearing down on him, he couldn't help but wonder if God had left him. At that moment, he heard footsteps. He turned and looked, seeing a man before him. Still fearing for his life, Jacob began to wrestle with him. He struggled for hours with the stranger and began to realize that this wasn't a normal man. He would never be able to beat him. As the sun was rising, the stranger touched Jacob's hip and the bone came out of the joint. Yet, even though he was now injured and in great pain, Jacob refused to let go. The stranger said, "Let go of me. The sun is rising." Jacob responded, "I'm not letting you go until you bless me." The stranger knowingly asked, "What is your name?" "My name is Jacob." Then the stranger smiled down at Jacob and said, "No longer will I know you as Jacob. You will be called Israel from this day on, because you have wrestled with God and men and prevailed." Then God blessed the newly named Israel and left him. Jacob fully understood what had happened. Breathless as he had been when he woke from his dream of the staircase, he whispered, amazed, "I have seen the face of God and lived." As the sun rose higher in the sky, Jacob slowly got up and began to limp back to his family. Though he still didn't know what his future with Esau held, he was a man who had been changed by God and would never be the same again. In the story of Jacob's return to Canaan, we see God strip away his ability to rely on himself. Though he tried to plan and scheme, he could not hope to defend himself or his family against the much more powerful force with which Esau approached. Though he tried to wrestle with and defeat God, he could not hope to overpower his Creator. When his hip was touched, injuring him, Jacob was reduced to hanging on to God, forced to rely completely on his mercy, and left begging the Lord to bless him. He had fought all his life only to realize that he couldn't do anything without God. The same is true for all God's children. In life, we all may face things we can't handle on our own. In fact, we all face the problem of our sin that, like Jacob, we cannot hope to solve on our own. Yet true to who he is, when things seem most desperate, God steps in and changes everything. But that is a story for another time. Genesis chapter 33. Brothers reunite. After wrestling with God, Jacob limped back to his family. Then he lifted up his eyes and saw dust rising on the horizon. Esau was coming with his 400 men. Had the gifts he sent ahead worked? Jacob didn't know, but now he trusted God with the outcome. He divided his family into groups, with Bilhah and Zilpah and their children going first, followed by Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. Then he went before them all and slowly walked toward his brother, his heart pounding. When Esau came closer, Jacob bowed down to the ground 7 times. Esau started to run toward his brother. This was it. The moment had come. Would he now get his revenge? Jacob braced himself as Esau spread his arms and embraced him, weeping with tears of joy. Jacob began to weep as well. The 2 brothers were reunited once again. They didn't need to say anything to each other. Esau had given his forgiveness in that one enormous hug. Jacob looked past his brother at the 400 men. Most of them had smiles on their faces. Esau looked past Jacob and saw the women and children. "Who are all these with you?" he asked. "God has been gracious to me, brother." "I can see that," responded Esau. Then the women and children all came before Esau and bowed down to show him respect. "What is all this for?" asked Esau, pointing to all the animals that Jacob had sent to him. "I was hoping they would help me find favor in your sight," said Jacob. Esau laughed. "I have enough, my brother. Keep them for yourself." "Esau," said Jacob, "please take them. I have seen your face, and it is as wonderful as seeing God himself. You have forgiven me. What more could I ask? I want you to have this blessing that the Lord has graciously given to me." Esau smiled and agreed. He even offered to travel with Jacob and protect him, but Jacob refused. "No, brother, thank you, but I will be all right." He looked up to heaven, knowing he already had all the protection he would ever need. The brothers parted joyfully, and Jacob safely traveled until he made camp before the city of Shechem. There he built an altar and gave it the name El Elohi Israel, which means God, the God of Israel. In the years following, Jacob would grow closer and closer to the Lord. He would rid his family of all false gods, and the one true God would continue to bless him, protect him, and provide for him, even through hardship. Very quickly, he would lose close family members, including his own wife Rebekah, while she was giving birth to another son, Benjamin. And then he would lose his father Isaac as well. Yet, he continued to walk with God, and when it came time to bury their father, the two brothers, who had once been bitter enemies, did so together and in peace. In the story of Jacob reuniting with his brother Esau, we see that Jacob had no reason to fear Esau. God had made him a promise to do good to him and protect him. Nothing could stop that from coming to pass. We learn that even through times of hardship, we can grow closer to God and find blessing in the process. And finally, in the two brothers, we witness that God is able to mend even the most broken relationships, and that forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds. Genesis chapter 37, The Dreamer. Though Jacob walked closely with God and was a man of great faith, he was by no means perfect. Just as he had favored Rachel over Leah, he also favored his 17-year-old son Joseph over all his other children. In fact, he favored Joseph so much that he made him an incredibly beautiful and richly decorated robe. When his older brothers saw this, they began to hate Joseph and treated him unkindly whenever they saw him. However, nothing would make them more angry than what Joseph was about to do next. He came to his brothers one morning, looking quite excited. "Brothers," he began, "I have to tell you about a dream I had last night. All of us were in a field, tying sheaves of grain together, and I couldn't believe it, but all the sheaves you tied together gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers looked at him astonished. "What are you saying? That you are going to rule over us?" they replied, and began to treat him with even more hatred than before. Now sometime later, Joseph had another dream. Believing that God was communicating with him, he went back to his brothers and said, "Listen to me. I have had another dream. I looked into the sky and saw the sun, the moon, and 11 stars. Then they all bowed down to me." Joseph's brothers wouldn't listen to him, so he went to his father Jacob and told him the dream. Jacob responded, "What do you mean, Joseph? That I and your mother and all your brothers are going to bow down to you?" However, after Joseph had left him, Jacob continued to think on what he said and wondered if God was trying to tell the boy something. Days later, Jacob sent Joseph out to look for his brothers who were pasturing the sheep, wishing to make sure everything was well with them. He traveled a long way and eventually saw them in the distance near a place called Dothan, where there were cisterns that used to hold water, but had now run dry. When his brothers saw Joseph and his rich robe, they grew angry and began chattering amongst themselves. "Look," they said, "here comes that dreamer." They were tired of his dreams, and especially how much their father loved him. Finally, one of them spoke. "Why don't we just kill him and throw him into one of these pits? Then we can just go back to father and say he was killed by a wild animal. We'll see if his dreams come true then." As cruel as this plan seemed, the others started to think this was a very good idea. All except for Reuben. You see, Reuben had dishonored his father some years earlier and was hoping to seek Jacob's favor by saving his favorite son's life. He said, "Brothers, what are we thinking of doing? Let's not kill him. Why don't we just throw him into the pit and leave him there?" His brothers agreed, and Reuben walked off by himself so he would not be guilty of the act. As soon as Joseph came among them, they tore off his robe and threw him into one of the cisterns. Feeling quite proud of themselves, they sat down to eat, while the echoes of Joseph crying out for help from the bottom of the pit rang in their ears. Suddenly, they looked up and saw a traveling caravan of merchants coming toward them, and Judah got an idea. "What do we gain from killing Joseph and hiding our guilt?" he asked. "What did you have in mind?" they replied. Judah pointed to the merchants. "What if we sell him? Regardless of how much we hate him, he is our brother. We shouldn't kill him, but at least we can get some money out of him." His brothers agreed this was a good idea. They drew Joseph up out of the pit and sold him for 20 pieces of silver to the merchants who were traveling to Egypt. When the caravan had gone, Reuben came back and looked into the pit, expecting to still see Joseph inside. When he didn't, he panicked and went to his brothers and said, "Joseph is gone. What can I do now to gain father's favor?" However, his brothers weren't listening. They were too busy dipping Joseph's rich robe into the blood of a goat they had killed. They all went together into their father's tent and said, "Father, we found this in the fields. Is it Joseph's?" Jacob's mouth fell open and tears welled up in his eyes. He fell to his knees and held the robe to his face, weeping. He said, "It is. He must have been killed by a wild animal when he went looking for you." Jacob then tore his own robes in grief, and for many days would do nothing but mourn for Joseph. Everyone tried to bring him comfort, but nothing they did would bring him any cheer. In the story of Joseph's dreams, we once again see the danger of showing favoritism. Though Jacob had seen the consequences of it time and time again, he hadn't yet learned his lesson, and the jealousy it would breed in his other children would rob him of the very son he treasured most. In the same way, we often will repeat the same sins over and over again. Yet, if God still remained faithful to Jacob, you can be sure he will still remain faithful to all his children. And as we will see very soon, He can still work for good, even in the most hopeless of situations. Genesis chapter 39. In the captain's house. Shortly after his brothers had sold him, Joseph arrived with the merchant caravan in Egypt. Though he was surrounded by crowds of people, he felt completely alone. Everything looked so different from the home he was used to, and no one spoke his language. However, it was not too difficult for him to understand what was happening. A man named Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's prison guard, walked up to him and looked him up and down. Then Potiphar motioned to one of the merchants, handed him some money, and pointed at Joseph. For the second time in days, he had been sold for a sum of money. Joseph began to work as a servant in Potiphar's house, and God was with him in everything that he did, giving him great success. No matter what the task, he did it better and faster than anyone else. Soon, Potiphar began to notice how hard Joseph worked and was so confident in the young man's ability that he placed him in charge of his entire house and all his possessions. However, Potiphar was not the only one who noticed Joseph. The captain's wife fell in love with Joseph because she saw that he was strong and handsome. Day after day, she would ask Joseph to love her back, and day after day, Joseph refused. "Please, leave me alone," Joseph said to her one day. "My master, your husband, trusts me with all that he has. How can I betray him and sin against my God by loving you?" Yet she would still ask, and Joseph did all he could to avoid even being in the same room with her. One day, when Joseph was alone in the house, Potiphar's wife grabbed his shirt sleeve and demanded, "You will love me." Joseph didn't even take time to respond. Instead, he threw off his shirt, leaving it in her hands, and ran from the house to get away. Potiphar's wife was so angry and insulted by Joseph that she called all the other servants together, as well as her husband, and told them that Joseph was the one who asked her to love him. Potiphar became enraged and immediately took Joseph out of the beautiful house and placed him in the dungeon where all of Pharaoh's prisoners were held. It was a deep, dark place that smelled horrible and was home to some of the worst criminals in Egypt. All hope seemed lost. And yet, God was still with Joseph. The young man began to work hard as he always did, and God caused the captain of the prison to show him favor. In fact, he placed him in charge of all the other prisoners, and knew that when Joseph was in charge, he didn't have to worry about anything. No matter what Joseph did, God made it succeed. In the story of Joseph's service in Potiphar's house and the imprisonment that came after, we learn many helpful lessons. We learn that keeping faithful to God is possible, even in the most difficult of times. We learn that no matter our situation, we should always work hard, as though we were working for the Lord as Joseph did. When we do, God will bless. On the other hand, we also see that faithful acts will not always be rewarded by those around us. Joseph did the correct thing when he refused to love Potiphar's wife. But in doing what was right, he still ended up in prison. Yet as the future will reveal, God works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And for Joseph, the purpose would be glorious. Genesis chapters 40 through 41. Interpreter of Dreams. While Joseph was in the prison, he was placed in charge of two men, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, who were accused of committing an offense against Pharaoh. One night, both men had different dreams, and when Joseph saw them the next morning, he noticed they looked troubled. "Gentlemen, why do you look so sad today?" asked Joseph. They answered him, "We have both had dreams, but we don't know what they mean, and nobody else does either." Joseph, who was very familiar with dreams, replied, "God is able to interpret dreams. Tell me." The chief cupbearer told his dream first. "In my dream, I saw a vine with 3 branches. They all blossomed and became full of grapes. I was holding Pharaoh's special cup, and I crushed the grapes into it for him to drink, and he did." Joseph smiled as God immediately revealed to him the dream's interpretation. "All of this means that in 3 days Pharaoh will bring you into his court, and you will once again hand him his cup as you did before." The chief cupbearer burst into tears of joy. "Thank you, Joseph. Thank you." Joseph replied, "When all this takes place, you can thank me by remembering me and telling Pharaoh what has happened, so that I may also leave this prison, for I have done nothing to deserve being here." The chief cupbearer eagerly agreed. When the chief baker heard the good news about the cupbearer, he immediately spoke. "Joseph, I also had a dream. In it I had 3 baskets on my head, and in the top one were all kinds of baked foods meant for Pharaoh. However, the birds kept flying down and stealing out of it. What does this mean?" When God revealed what this dream meant, Joseph's face fell. "All of this means that in 3 days, Pharaoh will bring you into his court, but to hang you for the wrong you have done to him." Sure enough, on the 3rd day, Pharaoh had a feast for his birthday, and he called both the chief cupbearer and the chief baker into his court. He restored the cupbearer to his former position, but hanged the baker for his offense. Yet, In all his excitement at being freed, the cupbearer forgot to mention how Joseph had interpreted his dream. For the next 2 years, Joseph remained in the prison until one night Pharaoh himself had some truly disturbing dreams. In one, he was standing by the Nile River and saw 7 healthy, fat cows come out from the water to feed in the pasture. But then, 7 ugly, thin cows came out from the water and ate the healthy cows whole. He woke with a start and was perplexed, but soon fell back to sleep. However, he had a second dream, where 7 healthy ears of grain grew from one stalk. But afterward, 7 unhealthy ears of grain sprouted up and ate the healthy ones whole. This time, he woke up and was incredibly troubled. He called together all the magicians and wise men of Egypt, but none could interpret the dreams for him. It was at this time that the cupbearer remembered how Joseph had interpreted his dream in the prison and how it had come true. He ran and informed Pharaoh, who called for Joseph to be immediately brought before him. Pharaoh's attendants helped Joseph shave and change into clean clothes and whisked him into Pharaoh's court. Though he was skeptical of Joseph, he was also desperate to know the meaning, so Pharaoh said, "I hear that you are able to interpret dreams. Is this true?" "It is not me who gives the interpretations, my Pharaoh, but God." Then Pharaoh explained both of his dreams to Joseph, and the young man listened intently, praying that God would give him the interpretation. Before Pharaoh was done speaking, Joseph knew what the dreams meant. "My Pharaoh," he began, "the dreams both mean the same. The 7 healthy cows and ears of grain are 7 years of plenty. There will be an abundance of food in Egypt, and no one will go without." Pharaoh began to smile, until Joseph continued. "But the 7 thin cows and unhealthy ears of grain represent 7 years of terrible famine that will completely consume all of Egypt and beyond. Because you had 2 dreams, it means that God has promised it will happen, and soon." Then, before Pharaoh could respond, Joseph offered, "My Pharaoh, select your wisest man to be in charge of the land and to oversee storing food for the next 7 years, so that when the famine comes, Egypt will be ready." Pharaoh was pleased with Joseph's suggestion and replied, "Who else has the Spirit of God like you? Since God has shown you this, you are the wisest, and you will be in charge of the land. Only I will be greater than you in Egypt." With that, he gave Joseph his signet ring, clothed him in fine linens, and placed a golden chain around his neck. Wherever Joseph went, people would bow before him. He married the daughter of a priest and had 2 children named Manasseh and Ephraim. When the 7 years of plenty came, Joseph wisely stored up food, and when the famine arrived, everyone in Egypt had enough. However, soon the famine began to extend to Canaan and the family of Joseph's father, Jacob. In the incredible story of Joseph's rise to power, we see the amazing way that God works in the lives of His children, even when they can't see it themselves. Joseph was sold into slavery, would be falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and placed into Pharaoh's prison. But his meeting with the chief cupbearer would lead him to stand directly before Pharaoh and save the land of Egypt. And yet, as we will see next time, God was not finished with Joseph's story. Though we, like Joseph, may go through times in our lives that are difficult to understand, we need to follow his example and remain faithful to God, trusting that even if we can't see or feel him working, he always is. Just as he began showing Joseph, God will never leave us and is working all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Genesis chapters 42 through 43. Familiar faces. The famine Joseph had predicted hit the land of Canaan very hard, and soon his long-lost family began running out of food. However, Jacob had heard there was plenty of grain in Egypt, so he sent all of his sons aside from Benjamin to travel there so they could buy food. When they arrived, they saw Joseph, but because he looked like an Egyptian, they did not recognize their brother. Immediately they bowed themselves to the ground before him, just as Joseph had dreamed years before. However, he recognized them and asked, "Where did you come from?" "We are from Canaan," they said. "We were hoping to buy some food for our family." Joseph looked down at them. "I think you are spies," replied Joseph. "You have come to see how weak Egypt is." The brothers insisted they were innocent, explaining they were simply 12 brothers from Canaan, but one was still with their father, and one had died. Joseph still insisted they were spies, and offered a test to prove themselves. "I will not let you leave Egypt," said Joseph, "until one of you goes back to your home and brings your youngest brother here, while the others remain in prison. If the one comes back with your brother, then you are telling the truth and can go free. If not..." Then Joseph motioned for the brothers to be arrested and held them in custody for the next 3 days. When the 3 days were over, Joseph came to them and said, "If you listen to me, you will live, for I believe in God. Let only one of your brothers remain here in Egypt. The rest of you may go with food for your family. However, if you wish to live, you will return to me with your youngest brother." The terrified brothers began to talk with each other, saying, "It is because of what we did to Joseph that this has happened. We heard him begging us to help him out of the pit, and we didn't listen. Now we are being punished." When Joseph heard them say this, he left them for a time and began to weep at the mention of what they did to him. When he came back to them, he ordered that Simeon be bound in front of them and taken into custody. Then he told his men to give them grain, but to also secretly give them back the money they had used to purchase it. Giving them supplies for the return journey, he sent them back home. on the way to Canaan, when they each opened their supplies, they found the money and became even more afraid that when they returned to Egypt, they would be accused of stealing. When they arrived, they told their father all that had happened to them, and the whole family was in distress. Yet, Jacob refused to let Benjamin go with them. Sometime later, after delaying as long as possible, their food began to run low again, and Jacob told the brothers to go to Egypt to buy them more. However, their father continued to refuse to let Benjamin go. Yet Judah reminded him that the man in charge of the grain in Egypt would not allow them to buy food unless Benjamin was with them. Jacob was distraught and asked them why they had told the man so much. Judah responded, "He questioned us about everything. He asked us about you and about our family. How could we have known that he would ask us to bring Benjamin? Send him with me so that our family may survive. I will protect him and bring him back to you. If I do not, let me bear the blame forever." Finally, Jacob agreed to let Benjamin go, but not before telling his sons to take many gifts, as well as twice the amount of money to give to the Egyptian when they arrived. In the story of Joseph's first interaction with his brothers since they sold him into slavery, we see that in everything that happened, God was moving and working. Had Joseph never been sold, he would have never traveled to Egypt. Had he never been falsely accused, he would have not been placed in the Pharaoh's prison. If Joseph hadn't been placed in charge of the chief cupbearer, he would not have stood before Pharaoh to interpret his dream, rise to power, and be able to provide food for not only Egypt, but his own family. Often, we don't know why we must go through trials that seem unfair. Yet, like Joseph, we must trust that God knows what he is doing, and that what we go through may just be him preparing us for something incredible. As we will see with Joseph and his brothers, that's exactly what God was doing. Genesis chapters 43 through 50. I am Joseph. Since the day he had sent them on their way, Joseph kept looking for his brothers to return. Finally, when he was once again in the market, overseeing the buying of grain during the famine, he saw their familiar faces in the crowd. As they came closer, he also saw that Benjamin was with them. Immediately, he ordered the steward of his home to bring them all inside his house for a feast. As the brothers were led in, they began to fear that they were going to be punished for stealing the money and the grain from the last time they had visited Egypt. They went to the steward to explain their innocence, but he merely responded, "Do not worry. You don't have to be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, gave you the money. I know you didn't steal anything." It was also at this time that their brother Simeon was brought out to them. He looked well. Certainly it didn't look like any harm had come to him, which brought them great relief. When Joseph came home from the market, the brothers came before him and bowed down again. "How are you all?" Joseph asked. "How is your father? Is he still alive?" "Yes, we are well, and your servant, our father, is well also," they replied. Joseph then looked to Benjamin and was hardly able to contain himself. He inquired, "Is this the brother you mentioned to me last time?" They nodded, and Joseph spoke directly to Benjamin. "God be gracious to you, my son." And at that moment, Joseph was so overcome by emotion and love for his brother that he hurried from the room to his own chambers and wept. When he was finally able to compose himself again, he came back and, seating the brothers in the order of their birth, commanded the food to be served. Everyone ate happily, relieved that seemingly everything was going to be okay. After they had finished the meal, Joseph secretly commanded his steward to fill the brothers' sacks with food, as well as their money again. However, this time he also ordered that his very own silver cup be placed in Benjamin's sack. In the morning, the brothers were sent on their way. They'd only gone a short distance when the steward caught up with them and accused them of stealing Joseph's silver cup. Of course, they denied doing so and were so confident they did nothing wrong that they declared whomever was found with the cup would die. To their horror, when their sacks were opened, the silver cup was found in Benjamin's bag. At this, they all returned to the city, and when they saw Joseph, they all bowed down to the ground. Joseph asked, "What is this evil you have done? Why have you stolen from me? Don't you know how powerful I am?" Judah, feeling responsible to defend Benjamin, spoke quickly. "What can we say? God has found out our guilt. Let us all be your servants, but do not harm the boy, please." "No," Joseph responded. "There is no need for you all to serve me. Only the one who stole the cup shall serve me. Go back to your father in peace." Then Judah approached Joseph and told him all that Jacob had said, how he had promised to protect Benjamin, and how returning without the boy would kill his father. But it was what Judah said next that surprised even Joseph. "Please, my lord, let me stay as your servant instead of Benjamin. Let me take his punishment on myself, and let him go back to our father, so that no evil will come to him." At this, Joseph could no longer contain himself and commanded that everyone leave them except the brothers. With tears in his eyes, he said to them, "My brothers, it's me. I am Joseph, who you sold into slavery. Don't be afraid, for I can see that what you meant for evil, God has turned for good. He sent me here, not you. He sent me so that I could save you all from this terrible famine." Joseph's brothers were stunned. "Hurry," said Joseph. "Go and tell our father that God has made Joseph ruler of all Egypt, and to come here and live in the land of Goshen. I will provide all that you need, for there are still 5 years of famine to come." They all wept together and talked of all that had happened in the years he had been gone. word came from Pharaoh, who had heard what had happened, that the brothers were to be given anything they needed to bring Jacob to Egypt, and that they could have the best of all the land. Quickly, they returned to Canaan and told Jacob the news, and he was overjoyed and determined to go and see Joseph. The whole family came to Egypt, and when Jacob and Joseph saw each other, they embraced and wept with joy. The family was together again, and Jacob would live in Egypt for the last 17 years of his life. He would meet and bless his grandchildren Manasseh and Ephraim. He would meet and bless the very Pharaoh of Egypt. And when it came time for him to die at 147 years old, all of Egypt mourned for him, and his sons brought his body back to the land of Canaan and buried him in the tomb where Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and his wife Leah were buried. Joseph's family returned to live in Egypt through the famine, and in the years after experienced none of the strife that had been between them before. Joseph had forgiven them completely, and when he was 110 years old, the time came for him to die as well. He said to his brothers, "Though I am about to die, God will bring you out of this land and back to the land he promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When he does, you must promise to carry my bones back as well, so that I may be buried in Canaan with our family." And with that, Joseph breathed his last. In the story of Joseph reuniting with his family, we see the conclusion of God's work to bring reconciliation to his chosen family. We also see the power of forgiveness, grace, and sacrifice. And as we leave the book of Genesis behind, we see that not only did God create all things, but he knows all things and works in all things to show his goodness, love, and mercy. And yet, as we will see, though this story has ended, God was still not finished. Hello, and welcome to Cross and Crown presents Storytime. Get comfy, close your eyes, and relax as we embark on an expedition through time to discover the amazing wonders of the Bible. Genesis 1. The beginning of all things. In the beginning, before there was anything else, there was God. And though he needed nothing, he created the whole universe, and more importantly, the earth. It was all a vast, empty space, and the earth had no form. However, God wasn't finished. Suddenly his voice rang out into the darkness and said, "Let there be light." And all the nothingness became flooded with a light brighter than any star, because it came from himself. God took that light and separated it from the darkness. He called the light day, the darkness night, and both of them good. The first day of creation was complete. On the second day, God looked at the water that was covering the whole surface of the earth and separated it into a beautiful sky and a quiet, tranquil sea. Clouds drifted along on a gentle breeze, and the whole ocean lay calm and peaceful. When the third day dawned, God told all the water to move into one place, and out of it emerged the dry ground. Yet it was all still empty. This would not do, so God caused all kinds of plants to spring up out of the empty ground. Every kind of fruit and vegetable, every kind of tree, bush, and grass responded to his voice, and with his voice he called it all good. Then God turned his attention to the enormous empty universe and began to fill it with all the stars, planets, and galaxies. He arranged them each in their place and called them all by name. For the earth, he created two special objects: the sun to give light in the day, and the moon to give light in the night. With that, the fourth day was complete. Once again, God spoke and told the empty ocean and sky to swarm with all kinds of creatures, from the biggest whale to the smallest seahorse. The water became filled with life. The sky was filled with every kind of bird, and suddenly the earth burst into a beautiful symphony of movement and song. God observed it all and called it good. The fifth day of creation was complete. Seeing the ocean and sky teeming with creatures, God then commanded the dry ground to be filled with every manner of animal. From dinosaurs and elephants to squirrels and ants, large and small, they all came forth, bringing glory to God. The universe, that just a short time ago had been lifeless and void, was now filled to the brim with life, color, and sound. In his creation, God reveals to us his majesty and splendor. He teaches us of his awesome power and that he is a God who makes wonderful things. What do you think is the most wonderful thing God created? And yet, even after all the amazing things God had done, the sixth day had not been completed. There was still one more thing he wanted to do, and it would be more wonderful than anything else that had come before. But that is a story for next time. Genesis 1 and 2. Very good. The moment had come. God had finished creating all the beautiful things we see today. He made the earth and gave it light. He made the stars and planets in space, all the plants on the earth, the birds for the sky, the fish and whales for the ocean, and the animals for the land. Everything was good, and everything was ready for God's finishing touch. He took his hands and began to dig into the dirt. With the great love and care of a master sculptor, he formed a man. Every detail, from each individual hair on his head down to each individual toe on his feet, was perfectly placed. The only thing missing was life. And so God breathed the power of his Spirit into the man, and suddenly his heart began to beat. His lungs filled with air, and he opened his eyes to see for the first time. Then God planted a beautiful garden in a place called Eden. It was full of every kind of amazing food to eat, and God brought the man, who was called Adam, there to take care of it, to take care of the animals, and to live in peace. In the middle of the garden, God showed the man two special trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, telling him he could eat from any tree he wanted except this second tree, because it would bring only sadness and death. Then, for the first time, God said something was not good. The man was alone. God brought every animal to him so he could give them names, but the man saw that none of them looked like him. Each animal had a partner with whom they could spend their time, but not him. However, God knew something the man did not. He had a wonderful gift in store. He caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, God took part of the man's side, closed it up with flesh, and out of it formed his incredible new partner, a woman. The next time the man opened his eyes, God presented the woman to him, and he was in awe. Finally, this was someone who was just like him. God was so pleased to give this man the incredible gift of woman. He blessed them both and told them to enjoy each other and to have a family. Both the man and the woman were without clothing, but they had no reason to feel ashamed. As the sun set on the sixth day, God looked at all he had made, and it wasn't just good. He said it was very good. On the seventh day, God did not do any work. He simply rested and took joy in all that he had made. He wanted the man, woman, and all their offspring to enjoy it too, so he blessed it as a holy day of rest. Through God's creation, we see his love and care. we see how He is faithful to fulfill our needs and loves to give His children good gifts, knowing what is for our best. We also see in the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that God loves us so much that He doesn't force us to love Him back, but gives us the choice. And next time, we will see how the choices of man will shape the rest of history. Genesis 3. Falling away. With choice comes danger. Sometime during the creation of all things, God also made messengers called angels. One particular angel was named Lucifer. He was a cherubim and held one of the highest positions in heaven. However, when he looked to the throne of God, he did not worship. Instead, he became jealous of God's power. He wanted to be God. And so he chose to rebel against God with a large number of other angels. Yet, they were defeated and thrown from heaven, and Lucifer became known as Satan, the enemy of God. Satan decided that if he couldn't have God's throne, he would try to hurt him in another way. All it would take was a little temptation. He disguised himself as a serpent, slowly slithered his way to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and waited for the perfect moment. It wasn't long before Adam and his wife appeared, and the snake asked a seemingly innocent question. Did God really say that you can't eat from any tree in the garden? We can eat from any of the trees in the garden, replied the woman, just not this one here. God said we can't even touch it or we'll die. That's a lie, said the serpent. God doesn't want you to know what He knows. I know what He's hiding from you. The woman and her husband looked at each other. God is hiding something from us? She asked. What is it? He knows that when you eat this fruit, said the serpent, you will know truth. You will know what is good and what is evil. And they leaned in closer, listening as the serpent looked around, his voice lowering to a whisper. You will be just like Him. Desire grew in their hearts. The fruit did look delicious. Their eyes widened and their mouths began to water. God is so wise, the woman thought, as her hand slowly reached toward the fruit. Why wouldn't He want that for us too? What could be so wrong about knowing what God knows? Adam watched as she plucked it from the tree, brought it to her lips, smelled its sweet aroma, and took her first bite. Seeing that she had not died, she gave some to him, and he also ate, but did not die. The serpent watched with a knowing smile. As the couple swallowed the sweet fruit, A bitter feeling began to settle on them. They saw they had no clothes just as before, but now something was different. Something was very wrong. They felt guilt, shame, and a strong sense that they should cover themselves. They spotted a nearby fig tree, quickly took some of its leaves, and sewed together crude clothing. Just then, step, step, step. Adam and his wife looked at each other in fear. "God's coming," said the woman. "Run," whispered Adam urgently. And so they ran and hid in the trees of the garden. In the story of the fall, we see how Satan tries to make us question how good God is. He appeals to our pride and questions if we should really obey God. We see how sin can look so good at first, and yet it never lasts, and there are terrible consequences because of it. However, don't worry. We will see next time that even though bad things came because of Adam and his wife's sin, God was about to make an amazing promise. Genesis 3, 9 through 24. Consequence and Promise. God walked slowly and sadly to the middle of the garden. He knew everything that had happened, how Satan had tempted Adam and his wife, how they had doubted him, how they had eaten the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, sinned against him, and tried to hide themselves. He knew exactly where they were and called to them as a loving father does to his children. "Adam, where are you?" Adam replied from his hiding place, "I heard you walking in the garden, and I became afraid because I was not wearing clothes, so I hid." "Come out, Adam." "Who told you you had no clothes?" asked God. "Have you eaten from the tree?" "The woman you gave me, she gave me some of the fruit, and I ate," said Adam. God turned to the woman and asked, "What have you done?" "The serpent tricked me. He lied to me, and so I ate," she said with tears in her eyes. God looked to the serpent and said, "For what you have done, you are cursed. One day a child will be born, and even though you will hurt him, he will completely destroy you forever. Someday he will make sure you never hurt my children again." Then God turned to Adam and his wife. He tenderly explained that life would